Today we are going to talk about game and violence, and this is part one of two lectures, which means we're going to continue on this topic next week. And for this week, I want you to watch this video and please answer my discussion questions and post your thoughts on the course blackboard later. To understand this issue, it's important for us to know the background, historical background of this ongoing issue. So one thing I want you to know is how it started. Back in 1982, there was this speech by Dr. Koop, who was U.S. Surgeon General. He talks about family violence. So he said, if we truly care about human life, if we truly care about the future of our society, then we have to move to confront the terrible implications of family violence. And then he added, okay, he went on and talked about some the video game. He didn't mention video games during his speech, but after his speech, during the Q&A, one of the reporters asked him about video games and then possible harms from the video game. And so he answered, there may be mental and physical harm because teenagers were becoming addicted body and soul to these games. Everything is Jeb the enemy, there's nothing constructive. But he admitted that there was no scientific evidence to support his view. Well, it seems like back then it was a big issue because a lot of times the content of video game is fighting or killing the enemy. So killing the enemy in kind of 8-bit or this um, this kind of minimalized images. So people didn't think killing the enemy in the game that serious, and because of it, some people shows their concerns. Their teenagers or even like younger children play this video game. The central goal of the game is killing the enemy. So the news and observers. I think this was the newspaper in Charlotte, North Carolina. They put these images. This is Dr. Coop, and then Pac-Man. So like they created this image of Coop Man. Okay. So let's try to think about this. Video games on young people. Okay. Again, Dr. Coop mentioned there may be mental and physical harm because teenagers were becoming addicted, body and soul, to these games. Everything is step the enemy, there's nothing constructive. So let's try to kind of deconstruct what Dr. Coop said. Okay? There may be mental and physical harm, and then he talked about teenagers were becoming addicted. And he also criticized video game uh, with the statement, "There's nothing constructive." Is that true? So, okay, video game, according to Dr. Coop, mental and physical harm, and then target audience would be teenagers. Then teenagers would be kind of vulnerable, so they easily become addicted, and everything is Jeb the enemy. So content of the game not necessarily good. Okay, all about Jeb the enemy, and there's nothing constructive. So there are discussion questions. Question number one: how would you define video game addiction? And have you been addicted to game? So let's try to think about like when we were young and maybe stupid. Okay, when you play video game, I mean, have you ever been addicted to game? Uh, I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether I was ever addicted to games. But it's true that sometimes, I mean, like especially when I was young or younger, Like I really couldn't control. I mean, I had a hard time to stop myself playing certain games. So what I really did was I couldn't trust myself, so I didn't start playing certain games. So, for instance, back in like late 90s, early 2000, many friends of mine played StarCraft, the StarCraft 1. But it seems to me many of my friends got kind of addicted to that game. So I didn't even start playing that game. So I never played that game because I couldn't trust myself. If I played it once, I thought I would want to play that game more. So I never tried that game. So that's kind of like me about me and addiction of game. But I want you to know like whether you have been addicted to game. If so, how would you define video game addiction? Like how would you define it? You don't have to find the definition of like game addiction. I really want to hear from you, from your own experience. Like you probably know, oh, like you can actually tell, like, oh, I was addicted to playing that game, right? Or I mean, you probably have that like a line somewhere. For instance, I really like that game, but I don't think I was really addicted. I mean, I just played that game a lot. Or you can say, yeah, I mean, I played that game a lot, so like I have to admit that I was kind of addicted. So I want to hear from you. I want to know your own definition of a video game addiction, and then share your experience about that video game addiction if you have one. If you don't have any experience of video game addiction, you can kind of share some experience with other people who you believe was addicted to games. And question number two is, how would you convince Dr. Coop that video games are not as harmful as he thought? And elaborate your answer with examples. So let's say, I mean, Dr. Coop admitted he didn't have any scientific evidence to support his statement, but that was kind of general perception on the video game. Okay, so I mean, if you think about like some older generation, people still think, oh, there's nothing like good, nothing constructive about video game, and they always worry about teenagers playing video game. And how would you convince those people that video games are not as harmful as they think? So I want you to kind of defend video game, and I want you to have at least one example. Okay, let's continue. Okay, fatigue from too much video gaming. So you have to understand like why people, especially Dr. Coop, ended up having that types of perception, like negative perception on video game. Okay, Dr. Coop's view was constructed from the video gaming boom from the late 70s. Okay, back then, like arcade machines everywhere, too many arcade rooms, too many video game companies, too many computer games. So eventually, it will kind of like cause. I mean, we had that video game crash, 1983. But you have to understand, like back then, we had too many video games, so people were concerned, and uh, that concern kind of uh, like emerged from like older generation because they witnessed that video gaming boom, but obviously the content of the game was a lot of like many times content of the game was killing the enemy and something negative. Okay, let's move on to kind of like 90s. You probably remember this Mortal Kombat controversy. So I want you to watch this video.
Combat, a fantasy martial arts game that some parents think is just too violent for their kids. Carol Lynn joins us live now from Northridge with more on that story. Carol?
Here it is, Bob, behind me. It's called Mortal Kombat, and we're going to talk to Aaron Brandis here about the game. Aaron, how does it work?
Well, basically, you pick a couple characters, you do maneuvers on the joystick, some buttons, you do moves, and
then what are you trying to get to? The fatality?
Nah, there's a master guy you got to beat at the end. Fatalities are just what happens if you're really brutal to your opponent. You get an opponent, you can rip off his head or something like that.
Sounds like a pretty thrilling game, and this is the kind of violence that critics are pretty worried about. Cold-blooded murder is making Mortal Kombat the most popular video game in history. Kids relish their victory and their bloody choice. Should they pull out their opponent's heart or simply rip his head off just to see his spinal cord dangle in a pool of blood? How do you feel about cutting his head off? After a $10 million advertising campaign, Mortal Kombat, debuting in home video today, is expected to sell 2 million copies at $50 a pop. A horrifying possibility for parents who can't believe the game makers are fantasizing about decapitation and murder.
I don't think they'll have this at home, no.
You don't think so?
A little bit too violent.
You look a little startled.
Yeah, it's a little too violent, I think.
That's pretty bad. That's just plain gross. Furthermore, advanced technology allows digitized video of real martial arts actors, making the action look real and not as cartoony. In fact, Mortal Kombat so shocked the managers at a nationwide arcade chain that they tried a sanitized version of the game. Instead of chopping the opponent's head off, he simply disappears. Sales dropped 40%.
They came up and said, what'd you do to the game? It's no fun anymore.
Kids are saying chill out to worried parents.
I think TV personally influences more than a video game. A video game is a video game.
The bottom line, parents wonder if kids can separate fantasy from the real thing.
Wait until they get out in a situation where they're fighting, and then they'll think about this and try to make it real.
But you know, game makers are saying that games are going to become more visually violent and more sexually violent as adults buy more video games. I mean, it's a big money market, $50 to $60 a pop. Plus, some of the critics say, or they at least concede, that parents have to be there in order to pay for the game, so at least there's some discretion there. And game makers are also talking about a new rating system similar to the movies. We'll see what happens. I'm Carol Lynn reporting live from Northridge. Back to you. All right, Carol.
Thank you, Senator Cole, and thanks to all the members of the panel. Just hearing what you've said now, we're also repelled. We're disgusted by this material, and yet it is a measure of our values in this society that we resist the impulse to do what I think, let me say for myself, I'd like to do. I'd like to be able to pass a law saying you can't produce this stuff anymore. We don't do that because we value our freedoms. But with those rights that the producers of video games, in this case, have also come responsibilities, and that's been the partner to rights in our society. And I think what we're all saying is that we don't feel that this particular industry has carried out those responsibilities in the way that they should, and now's the time to change. Dr. Page.
It's a video game that is shattering sales records.
That is to say the least. There's a good chance the teenage gamers in your house may be, well, playing it as we speak. And the adult content in Grand Theft Auto 5 begs the question, do you know what your kids are playing? Eric Fink has much more in tonight's big story.
You know, Michelle Rowland, the game made almost $1 billion in sales in just the first 24 hours. Places here in the Valley sold out. And some parents very cautious not to let their kids become influenced by Grand Theft Auto 5's racy images.
We already live in Canyon County, so there's a good chance that my children will be involved in crime at some point, and I don't want to buy them a game that will train them for that future.
Despite that less than ringing endorsement from a parent, the latest Grand Theft Auto is flying off the shelves, earning $800 million in just 24 hours. The shooting game not only features but glorifies murder, strong sexual content, and nudity.
A game that allows you to pick up prostitutes and kill them and collect their money. I don't know if that sends the most family-friendly message.
VIP game store owner Bill Greenway says that is exactly why GTA 5 is so popular with younger gamers. It gives them the chance to defy their parents.
The mere fact that you make something controversial and tell kids of a certain age that you can't do this, well, automatically that's like That's like pulling up a honey pot in the midst of a bunch of flies. It's like, oh, I'm not supposed to do that? Pachung, I'm going there.
The store opened up here Tuesday morning at 10 a.m. with 25 copies of GTA 5 on hand. It had sold out in less than 4 hours. Owners say that's unprecedented for a small independent game store like this. Gamer Sam Fortner would let his kids play the game.
I would be able to explain to my kid the difference between real violence and fake violence. That's the responsibility of a parent to teach their kid right and wrong. Playing a video game where you kill somebody is different than actually killing somebody.
Fortner calls Grand Theft Auto 5, no matter how violent and graphic, just another art form.
An artist is making a video game. An artist makes a painting a kid might not like. But should the kid not be able to walk into a museum and look at that piece of art?
Now, the company behind Grand Theft Auto 5 set an age restriction of 17 and up for buyers. VIP Game Store is required to check IDs. Live tonight, Eric Fink, Fox 9 on your side.
So is there a link between violent video games and these recurring acts of mass killing in our society? Well, the answer may not be as clear-cut as you think. Joining me now, live from Philadelphia, is Dr. Patrick Markey. He's an associate professor of psychology at Villanova University who researches video game violence. Dr. Markey, let's just get right to it. There's been plenty of research out there which shows a link between violent video games and aggression, but can we go so far as to say that playing violent games triggers or leads someone to committing any violent act?
No, it's very difficult to make that kind of claim. That, as you said, we know that violent video games are linked to increases in hostility and so forth, but there's really no evidence to suggest that such violent media is linked to these shootings or really any real-world violence. That what we find in our laboratory studies are very small effects affecting our thoughts, our cognitions, but not so much affecting our actual real behaviors.
What about minds that are psychotic? I suppose it's difficult to tell after the fact when these individuals are often killed, such as the Newtown shooter or the Navy Yard shooter, what triggered anything specifically. But the effect that a violent video game has on a normal college-aged male, those are the subjects of a lot of these studies, or adolescent, may not be the same when it comes to people who have serious mental problems.
No, you might absolutely be correct. The problem is we just don't know yet, that the research really is not there. It's irresponsible for researchers in my field to take research done on, as you said, normal adolescent males and so forth, and then try to generalize those findings to these actual horrific acts, that we're kind of essentially going beyond the data that we've collected in our laboratory when we try to predict it. So you might be right, but I mean, I would guess that the bigger cause of these types of situations are the shooter. I mean, it's already the news reports coming out that, I mean, he probably was paranoid, schizophrenic, and so forth. And looking for whether or not video games contribute to that really seems to be looking at perhaps the smallest effect here, if any.
Is there any evidence that playing these violent video games in which you are playing some sort of a role and shooting a fake gun, etc., has more of an effect in causing aggression, whether it's aggressive thoughts or aggressive acts, than, say, watching a very bloody and violent movie?
No, there are theoretical reasons why violent video games should have a bigger effect than violent television or movies, but empirically there's absolutely no difference. In fact, when we look at meta-analyses, which are big studies done on all the studies done in these areas, what we actually find is the average effect of video games is actually lower than the average effect of movies and television and so forth. And so, at the very least, it's unfair to say that violent video games have a bigger effect on an individual than other violent media.
What do you think as a researcher, every time there's one of these mass shootings, and they seem to be happening with disturbing and despairing frequency these days, it seems like almost every single time the shooter played these violent video games. I understand a lot of people who think there should be gun restrictions, more gun restrictions, think that even talking about violent video games is changing the subject from the most important thing. What's your reaction as somebody who studies this?
Yeah, I think you nailed it on the head, that I think this becomes a red herring, that essentially the profile of most of these shooters are they're males, they're between 20 to 30 years old. And the average age of video gamers is about 30 years old. In fact, it'd be more unusual to find one of these shooters that they didn't play video games. So really finding that they play violent video games is not particularly surprising, considering if you take a random sample of any males, most of them are going to report playing violent video games.
And lastly, sir, as somebody with young children, what do you say to the parents out there in terms of letting their children play Grand Theft Auto 5 or any of these other violent games? I don't know if you have children. Should children be allowed to play if you had children, or if you do have children, are they allowed to play?
Yeah, I have two wonderful children, and they're not allowed to play. And it's not because I'm scared that playing Grand Theft Auto is going to turn them into a killer or anything. The reason why we protect our children from violence, from violent video games, even from discussing, sometimes watching CNN even, is simply because we try to shield our children from this violence. We don't want to make them to be scared. It's not because we're going to make them to be killers. So I think it's a wise idea to not have a child play a violent video game. But that recommendation is not because doing so would turn that child into a killer. It's simply because doing so is exposing that child to something that's going to scare him or her. And as parents, our job is to protect our children.
So now I want to talk about this. Pros and cons of violent video game. We talked about Mortal Kombat and GTA 5, and there are many violent games out there. What would it be like pros of playing this violent video game? And what would it be cons of playing these video games? I want you to like discuss about this. Well, I would say some people believe there are some positive side of playing these violent games. Like for instance, these are things you cannot do in real life, so it will actually release your stress. Like sometimes, if you kind of fed up with all these negative things, you probably want to kind of display your violence towards other people or people around you. But by playing this game, violent game, you can actually release your stress to the enemies in the game, not people around you. So I mean, there could be some argument like that. Okay, instead of kicking and like punching other people around you, you can kind of quietly go to your game and then play games and release your stress. And obviously cons. Sometimes if you play these games too much, you mix up the reality and the game words, so you get desensitized about this violence, and then you express your violent behavior towards other people. So it can go either way, but I want to hear from you. What would be pros of playing this violent video game, and what would be cons of playing this violent video game? And I'll look forward to your answers on the course blackboard. All right, that's pretty much it for today and this week, and I'll see you next week.